Well, folks, thanks for coming today. It's great to see such a quiet turnout for our first Brownbag of the semester. In the interest of time, I'm going to let our speaker today introduce himself and tell you a little bit about what he's going to speak about. But I do just want to mention that later in the week, we've got our first film on Friday night at the Kino. It's going to be Bessa, or Bessa, I'm not sure exactly in terms of pronunciation, but it's Solemn Promise. And I've got a film flyer over here if you're interested in finding out more about the movie and what it's about. It's at 7 p.m. Right here in P18 on Friday evening. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Mikkelson.
Okay, thank you very much, Bart. I'm not going to waste any time. I want to get right into the subject because I've promised Bart that I will leave as much time as possible for questions and answers. I have written up a sort of a conclusion to the memos that I've been sending to you for the last couple of months. So my concept falls under the title of Russia at a Crossroads. Should be plural. I went back and forth on that, but it definitely should be plural. I checked in dictionaries today. October 2011 to January 2012. Capitals and provinces. First of all, definition of terms. Crossroads in Russian is перепутье. It's a singular word. A fork in the road. Neither choice will be a continuation of the direction you have been taking. When you reach a true перепутье, whichever direction you go from there, it's not the continuation of what you've been doing, it's different. Putin, as a candidate for the presidency of Russia, albeit with the huge advantage of incumbency, seeks to have Russia continue on its present course, which would mean, if it were possible, and it is not, remaining in place. Топтаться. На месте. His alternative routes, as I understand it, are either Putinism or chaos. That's the way he envisions things. And that's the choice, incidentally, for someone that you may, as I do, have a great deal of respect for, like Evgeny Primakov, who was on television just the other day talking about how important it is to re-elect Putin president. And, for that matter, our visiting Russian writer last spring, Petersburg prose writer Mikhail Kuraev, who was a very bright man and who was afraid that Russia may fall into chaos if it decides to, or ends up changing things too rapidly. And this is also the position of the oldest, really, really dear friend that I have in Russia, whose name is Isolda Ivanovna. She's over 85 years old. She gets a birthday card every year from the president of Russia, whoever he may be. And that's enough for her at her age to always be a supporter of the president. So, the second part of the concept in the title, October, to be more precise, October 10th was the day that I arrived, my wife and I arrived in St. Petersburg, 2011, and we left the day after Christmas, Russian Christmas, on January 8th, 2012. These were the 90 days allowed for any stay on my current multi-entry visa, and the actual 3 months of my stay. I could not have stayed legally at this another day. And I can't go back again now for 3 months at least. One of the always possible premiums of our profession as area specialists, and this is a little bit like playing roulette, maybe even Russian roulette, is that we may, by chance, be located in the Reese country of our choice at a critical point in its history. For example, Bruce Menning, known to all of you, or most of you, was in Moscow in September of 1993 and witnessed the artillery shelling of Russia's Parliament building. If I'm not mistaken, our dear friend Gerald Mikkelson was in Czechoslovakia in 1968 and witnessed the Prague Spring. At least their analyses, Geralk's and Bruce's, one by a political scientist, the other by a military historian, had some disciplinary validity. With the exciting recent events in Russia, what you see is what you get. That's me. Philologist, a literary scholar, trying to bury himself in the Pushkinsky Kabinet of Pushkinsky Dom, the Russian Academy of Sciences, Institute of Russian Literature, trying to unravel the secrets of Pushkin's poem Prorok, the prophet, who ends up suddenly distracted by the spontaneous unraveling of historical events in and around him in Russia. Last part of the formulation of the title, Capitals and Provinces, because I spent 4 days, November 17th to the 20th, in Moscow, 8 days in Siberia, December 3rd to the 10th, in Novosibirsk in transit, 4 hours in each direction at the airport, which was itself an interesting experience. Had to listen to sort of schmaltzy American Christmas music both times for the entire 4 hours while I was trying to write a talk. That was on my way to Gorno-Altaysk in the Altai Republic, where I was a guest for a week. And then 5 days in the Urals, December 10th to the 14th in Yekaterinburg, and the remaining 11 weeks in St. Petersburg, Russia's second capital. So this is how I try to validate my claim that I have something to say about the provinces as well as the capitals. Urals and Siberia, St. Petersburg and Moscow. Now, let's talk a little bit about the origins of the current protest movement. In the final installment sent to you by Bart yesterday, at my request, of my report to you by email, Rasilka, I recommended reading Simon Schuster's article in the latest January 30th issue of Time magazine as a good primer on the background to our discussion. In that article, Schuster writes, and I quote, "The protests were sparked by the parliamentary elections of December 4th, when Putin's United Russia party was accused of rigging more than 10 million votes in order to hold on to its majority. The day after the ballot," I'm continuing the quote here, "the day after the ballot, about 7,000 people took to the streets of Moscow to demand a revote, chanting out the phrase, 'out with the party of crooks and thieves.' Партия воров и жуликов." Alexei Navalny was the main subject of that article by Simon Schuster in this week's Time magazine. Russian blogger par excellence. He was the one who gave this virile nickname to United Russia, the party of thieves and crooks. In the next paragraph of that article, Schuster asks, and I quote again, "Why, only after the disputed vote held on December 4th, have Russia's citizens ceased to be a silent, apathetic mass?" Unquote. Now, these remarks in Time magazine ring true for me, but do not contain the whole truth. The seriously flawed elections of December 4th were preceded earlier in 2011 by two events instigated by Vladimir Putin that turned out to be colossal mistakes on his part. First, by announcing what is called rakirovka, this is a relatively new word in that meaning, at least in the Russian language, which means there's no exact equivalent of it in English. I call it the shuffle of the tandem, because Medvedev and Putin have been referred to for the past 4 years as the tandem, and the shuffling of the tandem means that they switch places. They change places on the happy-go-lucky bicycle built for two. That's what rakirovka means for me. That was the first mistake. announcing that, making that decision, having evidently made it long ago, but kept it a secret from most of the world. The second big mistake was holding a triumphal party congress of Единая Россия, United Russia, in Moscow's huge Luzhnikov Stadium. Putin and his clan deeply offended a very substantial part of the Russian electorate, especially its opinion makers, intellectual elite, and even a good many new Russians, members of the unstable but not insignificant younger middle-class managers, who are often referred to as office plankton, and ironically even call themselves office plankton. Plankton is the animal and plant life in a body of water that has no control over its own movement. It's just washed this way or that by the currents. That wasn't too far off, was it?
No, it's perfect.
Okay. The Luzhnikov Party Congress, with its mass toadying and tumultuous applause, бурные аплодисменты, for Putin, reminded the entire nation of Communist Party congresses in the Brezhnev era, if not just yet, and I threw this out a few times and got a somewhat negative response to it for reasons which I don't need to explain, I think. It even reminded me a little bit of the 1935 Nationalist Socialist Parteitag. Was it in Munich or in Nuremberg? The one that's on film, or the famous Nuremberg. Thank you. Thank you, Ron. You would have caught me on that one, wouldn't you? No, so that's going too far. But it reminded the entire nation of those Communist Party congresses during Brezhnev's time. And I've seen a few of those on television over the years, too, starting in 1966. So that's my preliminary remarks about the origins of all this protest and this crisis. So what has happened in Russia since the December 4th elections? First of all, and I was able to perceive this response, this first response, as it were, not in one of the capitals, but in my guest house room in Gorno-Altaysk, in cold and snowy Gorno-Altaysk, way down in southwestern Siberia, near the Mongolian and China and Kazakh, near the. Just do the thing here with my. I brought my right there. That's where I was. 4 time zones away from Moscow and St. Petersburg. I arrived there on December 4th, the day of the elections. It was quite cold and it was snowing. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful outside. I'm a northerner, I'm crazy, I like snow. So that first response, which I was able to see on television, and it seemed to me, again, this is a very crude comparison. You remember how long it took Joseph Stalin to actually make a public statement over the radio in June 1941, after the Nazi invasion? It seemed to me it took almost as long, this is all relative of course, for Putin and Medvedev to make their first appearance together on the television screens. And what they demonstrated to me and to everyone else that I talked to who observed that was shock and disbelief on their part, on their faces. Shock and disbelief with the election results. Despite the best efforts of Putin's supporters, his lackeys, what one commentator called bydla. Now this is a Russian word. If you don't know it, you should know it. Bydla. I guess I don't need to write it. Let me write it on the board. What the heck, if I can find that. There's a chalk here. This is not usually in your Russian textbooks. You might not even find it in your dictionary. You won't find it in Dahl's dictionary, for example, even though it's a very old Russian word. And the only closest translation that I've been able to come up with for this word is yoke cattle. Cattle or oxen who pull some kind of a weight behind them. That's what bydla meant historically. And now it was used by one of the commentators Shenderovich on television in reference to those lackeys of Putin who did all the smiling and clapping at the party congress. And they're not just the ones who were there, but you have this bydla, in the opinion of Shenderovich, around the country, and the attempt that was being made to control and to predetermine the outcome of the election. As I watched the figures come in on TV, because it wasn't just an appearance by Putin and Medvedev, but even before that, as we do in our media here, granted we don't start doing this until the last polling place closes, like last week at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in South Carolina, then they can flash up the what do you call them, the results of their queries with people coming out of the voting places and so on. It started a bit earlier than that, but by the next morning you had all kinds of statistics on the board which turned out to be more or less accurate. Putin and Medvedev, of course, tried to put the best possible face on what was for them obviously a minor or maybe even a major catastrophe. Now, that was the first reaction. And then very shortly after that, you had protest demonstrations occurring all over Russia. According to one report, in the December 26th issue of the newspaper St. Petersburgские ведомости, one of the most outstanding local newspapers in the country that I'm familiar with, these protests took place in at least the following cities: Moscow, St. Petersburg, Khabarovsk, Krasnoyarsk, Novosibirsk, Barnaul, Yekaterinburg, Samara, Nizhny Novgorod, Arkhangelsk, and other cities not named here. Culminating in the mass meeting with perhaps as many as 100,000 people, although these figures are always disputed. The FSB estimated at about a fifth of that. The New York Times suggested 100,000 and showed us a picture of it, an aerial view of the crowd. It looked more like 75,000 than like 15,000 to me, at least. And this took place on Akhmeditian Sakharov's Prospect, or street in Moscow, on December 24th. The separate meetings, two separate meetings on that same day, were held in St. Petersburg. One on Sakharov Square, between St. Petersburg University and the Academy of Sciences Library. Now, the fact that it was on Sakharov Prospect in Moscow and on Sakharov Square in St. Petersburg, of course, was not an accident at all. It was symbolically extremely important for the demonstrators to request and to get permission to hold their demonstrations in places that bore the name of Andrei Sakharov. My wife and I were there in that December 24th demonstration as observers. I had actually gone to the previous one in St. Petersburg, which was on a different square near the Vitebsky Vokzal train station and near the theater, the Juice, the theater of young viewers, a little bit out farther from Nevsky Prospect, but not very far at all. We can still call that the center of the city. Now, so shock and belief, disbelief, and then the demonstrations. Since then, what happened? Almost immediately, you had some arrests and detainments. The identity of those who arrested was easily and quickly known to the media and to the public. Persons who were detained were interviewed several times while they were still confined, as it were, and demonstrations were held on their behalf, not all of them sanctioned. In fact, most of them are not sanctioned, which caused a bit of a problem for the authorities and in some cases for the demonstrators themselves. Because when you had these people in confinement, under arrest, one name in Moscow which was particularly important was the name of Udaltsov, a young man who is a leader in one of the small parties, in Russian political parties or groups. And Khvostenko is the most prominent name of someone in St. Petersburg. But then, not long after that, you had their release. They were released. I'm just sort of going through the facts here now without any commentary. And I have just about maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes more of, maybe 8 minutes more of comment, and then we'll open it up here. So, the thing that happened after that is something that has nothing whatsoever to do with the demonstrations or the political crisis or the Russia at the Crossroads. It's something that happens at least twice a year all over Russia. It happens once in the month of May when everything shuts down and people go home and take it easy. We call those the splashные майские праздники. From just before May Day until just after the celebration of the great victory over the Nazis in Europe, the Победа. So, and the second time of the year when that happens is at the end of the year and the beginning of the following year. So what you had was the virtual shutdown of Russian society for 2 entire weeks. From Thursday, December 29th, when I had to hurry up and get out of Pushkinsky Dome because all my colleagues told me that I would be locked in if I stayed a little bit too long with my Pushkin. Actually, there was a party there too, so it was mostly, you know, what am I raising my hand for? You don't do that sort of thing in academic institutions. From December 19th, Thursday, until Thursday, January 12th, for two entire weeks, the society was essentially shut down. During which time, the New Year's and Christmas, January 7th, holidays took place. Now, during this period, as I suggested to you in my memo from yesterday, the Russian Orthodox Church hierarchy took temporary charge of the airwaves against a background of the most vigorous and freewheeling discussion of public affairs that the Russian media have seen, maybe since the halcyon days of perestroika, let's say 1987 to 1990, 91, if not since the aftermath of Russia's abortive but temporarily liberating revolution of 1905, an extraordinary short period of freedoms of press and assembly and so on and so on. It was, we'd have to put those in the same category, at least those brief periods. Now, since then, what's happened? Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin's TV appearances before large audiences of including very prominent people, his travels to various parts of the country, none of these trips, of course, being accidental or being unrelated to the situation and what he is trying to accomplish. Meetings with journalists. A big meeting, you can watch and listen to the whole thing if you want to on the internet. Start with yandex.com and go on from there. And you can get the questions that were asked him, you can get his lengthy responses, and you can also see the faces of the people who, for one reason or another, did not ask any questions at all. And more recently than that, 2 large and very substantial, substantive, written position papers. In the latter category, and there will be more, I'm told, we would call these white papers or something of the sort if they were in our culture. The first one was called, to put it in 2 words, which are in the title and the first and the last sentences, I believe, of them, Россия сосредоточивается. Now, normally when you use the verb сосредоточиваться, you translate it as to concentrate on something, and then you have to add on what? Я сосредоточиваюсь на работе. I'm concentrating on my work. But here it doesn't have that prepositional phrase after it. It's just Россия сосредоточивается, which means that it requires a different translation. It turns out that this phrase is taken from a speech given 150 years ago by Russia's foreign minister at the time, Alexander Mikhailovich Gorchakov, in the late 1850s, following Russia's humiliating defeat in the Crimean War. In a famous statement in speech, he said, "Россия сосредоточивается." He was evidently answering the question, well, what is the future of Russia going to hold now after the defeat in the Crimean War? And that was his answer. I've thrown around some other translations of it without the prepositional phrase, like, Russia is taking its counsel. Or perhaps Russia is licking its wounds. All of these are approximate now, but they come to mind when you try to figure out how to translate that without the prepositional phrase indicating that you were concentrating on something in particular. That first statement, which I suggested to you, is written in a style which almost caused my stomach to gurgle a few times. Extols the virtues of stability and economic growth that Putin attributes to his own astute guidance of the nation for the past 12 years. The second of these position papers came out in yesterday's issue of the ironically named newspaper Независимая газета, which is actually the organ, the mouthpiece of the government of Russia, which Putin heads, of course, as prime minister. This one is called Россия – национальный вопрос. Национальный вопрос, which I translate as Russia's nationalities question. Russia's nationalities question, in which Putin's ghostwriter, and this is absolutely obvious in the first half to 2/3 of it that it wasn't written by Putin at all. It's written by a ghostwriter who is in a very erudite manner, very learned and erudite, and I would say even eloquent manner, quoting Russia's primary chronicle, Saint Ilarion's 11th century sermon on law and grace, and the first wave emigre philosopher Ivan Ilyin as proof that it has been Russia's destiny for 1,000 years to bring enlightenment to all the other races and ethnic groups living within its borders and immediately beyond, and to provide a model for other countries in Europe and North America of the successful multinational state. Toward the end of this article, Putin takes over. There's an obvious zdvig, stylistically, almost as abrupt as the one in Pushkin's historical poem Medny Всадник, when you go from the preface, from the prologue, in the panegyrical style of the 18th century to Печален будет мой рассказ. I have a sad tale to tell now about Бедный Евгений. Putin takes over the writing of the last part of this, because the prose becomes opaque and pedestrian, and the message seems to be, take your pick, folks. It's either Putin or Pugachev. I thought Professor Alexander would appreciate that one. So, folks, folks, this is where we are at now. Let's put our heads together and see if we can correctly interpret some of the salient features of the current situation and come up with some sage advice for President Obama, for Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and for Michael McFaul, our new ambassador to Russia. My final remark before we begin our discussion. One, I will repeat myself from the end of yesterday's memo to Kreis, to all of you, in which I said, Russia today is a vital civic society in the making. And I said the outcome is uncertain, but the impulse for sweeping change is strong and unmistakable. I'm sorry to disappoint Ray Finch and those of the rest of you who may have thought that I was going to make a prognosis. I am not. And the second and last quotation that I would like to make here is from an article, not in Time magazine, but in the January 21st through 27th issue of The Economist, which came to my mailbox just yesterday, on Russia as a part of the emerging world that is making the strategic error of relying on one form or another of state capitalism. And the quotation there says, with reference to Russia, state capitalism's supporters argue that it can provide stability as well as growth. Russia's wild privatization under Boris Yeltsin in the 1990s alarmed many emerging countries and encouraged the view that governments can mitigate the strains that capitalism and globalization cause by providing not just the hard infrastructure of roads and bridges, but also the soft infrastructure of flagship corporations. That's the end of that quote, and then there's one more that pertains to Russia in that same article in The Economist, of course, anonymous article. In Russia, a clique of bureaucrats, a new word for me, bureaucrats, often former KGB officials, dominate both the Kremlin and business. Thus, the model produces cronyism, inequality, and eventually discontent, as the Mubarak's brand of state capitalism did in Egypt. Now let's have a go at it. Okay, we have half an hour
I
left.
have two. One comment and one
I think Jay
question.
had his hand up first.
Oh, okay. Alexander is first.
I just want to quote that great philosopher, Yogi Berra. When you come to a fork in the road, pick it up.
Take the road and take
I had forgotten that one. Alex?
The word "rokirovka" that you referred to is familiar to every Russian chess player, and it means changing the figures on the chessboard.
Right.
But my question is that it means then what Putin did with Medvedev is within the rules. And it's the message I think to the Russians is that is permissible, is within the rules. Do you think that Putin tries to maintain the appearance that he is playing according to the rules with, for example, Alexei Navalny and others who were detained for 15 sutak, the usual 15 days, and then released? Nothing happened to them, because knowing the regime, they might have done something else. That's the question.
Yeah.
And a very quick one on a personal note. You watch TV, you saw Putin's appearances, and you comment on his face. Does he try to be Hollywoodish thing? It's Botox, or what is it? No, it's really something
Well,
changed.
we could spend 6 or 8 hours just addressing those two questions. As for the first one, though, I think the answer is definitely yes, that Putin is trying to create the impression that he is operating within the rules. And yet, if you read very carefully that first position paper, the one called Russia is licking its wounds, or whatever, at least all of us who have been in this game of Russian, East European, Eurasian area studies for years, we learned long ago to read between the lines. Here, you have to read between the lines every bit as carefully as you did, even more so, perhaps, in Soviet times. Because what you see here is a surface remarks by Putin in his own language, for the most part, in that first one. And then, just a little bit under the surface, you see one after the other of what I would call veiled threats directed at all sorts of elements of Russian society who are problematic for him at the moment. And the only ones that he identifies, and this not by name even, he identifies them to the extent that anyone listening knows exactly who he's talking about, be it Navalny or be it, let's say, Mikhail Prokhorov is one of his favorites. Mikhail Prokhorov shouldn't be taking all of his money to New Jersey to buy the nets. He should be maybe bringing the nets back to Russia. In fact, he may have even said this. He's going to bring the whole National Basketball Association to Russia as soon as he gets all the teams under his control. So he doesn't say Prokhorov, but you know who he's talking about. And it's kind of soft criticism. Because everyone who hears this and reads that knows perfectly well that umpteen members of his clique, of his clan, of Putin's clan, are putting money in offshore accounts and so on too. And Putin probably is one of the wealthiest people in Russia. But he doesn't identify, either by name or by insinuation, those elements within the society which present a real danger to him. The people who can't be made a fool of, you know. Just to give you one or two examples, somebody like Yevgeny Yasin, one of the elder statesmen of Russian post-perestroika and post-Soviet politics. He's on the radio quite regularly on Echo channel. He admitted just before the elections that he didn't know for sure which party he was going to vote for, but it would probably be Yabloko.
And what about Latinina?
Well, Latinina is, well, I'm not sure how she voted, if that's what you mean. But Putin avoids mention of anyone like Yevgeny Yasin. Of course, he's not a threat because he's too old to do anything, except maybe be a senior advisor to the Minister of Culture or whatever in a future government that one can imagine. But Putin also doesn't mention or even hint at the identity of someone like Nikolai Ryzhkov, who is an extremely eloquent man who was in the Gorbachev and Yeltsin governments, I think, and who could easily be appointed overnight as the minister of any one of the departments of government if there were a big changeover after Putin's.
And he would be good at it.
And he would be very good at it. And there are any number of people like that who are on the airwaves, not just on Echo and not just writing for Novaya Gazeta, which is by far and away the best of the newspapers, although most of the rest of the newspapers are wide open now too, except for the three that I mentioned. Or no, except for TV stations are also wide open, except for the three that I mentioned. Первый канал, Россия 1, and NTV. They're all just government mouthpieces. NTV is particularly nasty. They do the dirty work. They're the bad cops, as it were. The other ones, you know, especially Первый канал, that's got to have a gloss of respectability about it. And Россия 1 has a decent movie now and then, and so on and so on. So, probably haven't answered your question, but I can't answer the second one, you know, more. What was the second question again? I didn't begin to answer.
Botox.
Pardon?
Botox. Putin's theory.
Oh, yes. Well, I tell you, I'm a philologist. I'm not a depth psychologist. I'm not only not a политический обозреватель, political scientist or anything, but I'm not a psychologist either. But I was so mesmerized by watching Putin 2 nights ago, not live, but that meeting that he had with journalists at a long table like this, maybe 40, 30 people sitting there, and the big meeting that he had way back in December 15th in a large hall on television, live television, with people like Nikita Mikhalkov asking questions, like Fyodor Bondarchuk, magnificent actor, film and theater actor, and so on. Very famous people, very highly respected people in various professions asking him some tough questions. There were very famous people there too who threw him really softballs. Like Valery Gergiev, for example, the renowned director of the Mariinsky Theater. He just thanked Vladimir Putin for being so kind and generous to the Mariinsky Theater. But there were some tough questions. Even Nikita Mikhalkov, you know, who has questionable motives much of the time. But the most mesmerizing thing was to listen to Putin and to observe his gestures and his facial movements, the muscles in his face. And I can't even begin to tell you what it displayed. The closest that I can come to that right at this moment is that I will confess now to those of you who don't know this, that I was trained also in military intelligence during the Cold War, okay? Field intelligence, not the fence lifting stuff, you know. I never crawled under any fences, okay? And I never took any pictures of illegal things. I was field intelligence, okay? If there had been a war, I would have interrogated Soviet prisoners. But the kind of qualities and skills and craftiness and really astounding adeptness that Putin displays when he is confronted by even a large room full of people who are all grilling him, they are either the skills of a highly proficient debater. I was a judge for high school debates here when my kids were going through Lawrence High School. And I saw how devious they are, you know, because they're not really arguing out of their convictions. They just have a bunch of cards, you know, and they're trying to kto kovo. They're trying to turn the tide against the other side. That's what Putin is doing every step of the way, every word that he utters, every movement that he makes. He's trying to put down the other side. But the thing that I would suggest that is there is that this is one of the most highly skilled interrogators, you know, former KGB agent. It's no wonder that he had a successful career in that field before Boris Yeltsin elevated him into politics, per se. Because that's what he can do. And I can recognize that because I was not one of them. Of course, I was down, you know, in the field, crawling in the dust, you know, and trying to decide what I would ask a Russian prisoner, a Soviet prisoner, if he was sent to me. That's Putin. Now, I have suggested in my memos that there's not a shred of what I would call classical statesmanship in him at all. This is my guess. I'm just speculating now. There is certainly not a shred of eloquence like we expect from our national leaders at a time of extreme crisis, like James Madison, for example, or Thomas Jefferson, or Abraham Lincoln, or FDR in U.S. history. Not a shred of that. Not a shred of that. He doesn't have that. So he can't really display it to anyone's satisfaction and conviction. It is a game, high-stakes game, at which he is extremely adept. And yet, as I have suggested in my memos, this is an emperor without any clothes. His credibility is zero now in the country, except for those people who belong to that category of bydla, okay, who have everything to lose if he loses, and who have nothing to gain if they protest anything. But now you see protests coming from middle-level oligarchs even, mini-oligarchs, in the provinces, in Yekaterinburg, in Gorno-Altaysk, in the newspapers, in the local newspapers, saying, hey, wait a minute, we got to change things here. This is our country that's going down the tubes, you know. So, and in some cases, it's coming from people who have recently served in his administration. People like, what's the finance minister's name again? The ex-Kudrin, okay? Kudrin has a kind of an ambiguous position here. He's not really trusted by the demonstrators, by the leaders of the protesting parties, because they think that he's too just, you know, going to serve Putin in the final analysis. I don't know. Maybe he could be useful as a mediator. And also you have the patriarch. Where is the patriarch in all of this? I don't want to try to characterize the patriarch. He's the holy father of Russia, who's looked up to by everyone, except there are some studies that indicate that he may have been on the payroll of and had a nickname even of, I've forgotten what it is now, during Soviet times as a paid operative of the KGB. Kirill. It's not been proven, but it's something more than just a rumor that somebody made up to discredit him. And it wouldn't surprise most people in Russia if that turned out to be a provable accusation. But, as I said, I don't want to judge that because I was impressed by his eloquence, I was impressed by what he said, and I believed him when he said that he's really concerned about the fact that most people in Russia are really suffering now under the present regime. And I was impressed when he said that we need to have change. When Putin says that, I don't believe a word of it. But I tend to believe the patriarch when he says that we've got to listen more carefully, we've got to make changes, we've got to move in the direction of having a more open society and so